Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm going to continue going through some of my exciting hands from the 50k PPC from the stream table as we remain on the Stone Cold bubble. It's still stud 8 or better, which is the same as the last video I made on this topic, and I played a number of interesting hands in this orbit of stud 8 or better, got kind of hit over the head with the deck pre. None of them really went that well for me, to be honest with you, but I decided to dive into this one a little bit here as I play a pot against João Vera in a situation where we are both a little bit on the short side and needing to be pretty cautious on the money bubble here as our stacks are dwindling. We can see that João has about 10 big bets and I have something like 12 or 13. So certainly feeling the pressure in a game like stud 8 where getting scooped can be very painful. At the same time, João picks up a very strong hand with pocket queens and the 3 showing. In stud 8 or better, when you have a buried high hand with an up card, a low up card, it is quite advantageous because you have a lot of inside information and your hand is very well disguised. And you will see how that influenced my play here in this hand. One thing to note, I understood at the time that João was going to be playing quite tight, and he does decide to raise with a 6 behind him from the chip leader of Albert Daher. So I expected him to be very tight here. Normally, with a hand as strong as ace-3-5 in the bring-in, I do think you should consider a lot of 2-bets in this situation, but because I thought his range was going to be so tight, I decided to play a pretty tight and passive strategy myself and just decide to call. And I think this is where we should start trying to narrow down the ranges using StudFlopDraw Alpha. So I'm going to go ahead and work on that now. We'll first take a look at João's range. StudFlopDraw Alpha has updated a little bit since the last time I used it here. We can now filter by equity, percentile, individual combos, or pro poker tool syntax. But I'm most familiar with doing it by percentile. So let's just go ahead and look at what the top of his range looks like in this situation. It's kind of convenient that it's a 3 versus a 3 door because it's going to be kind of easy to see which hands are good against that, right? So the first point would be to see where we should really, range him given the pre-flop play here. I'm looking at 30% as maybe a starting point. I'm thinking as I look at this range that it looks a little bit too wide. So one thing that's nice about this range is notice that it really only has split 3s with a low. It also only has it has ace 8 lows. Basically this has almost any 2 lows except for the weakest offsuit ones. So he's folding hands like 7-3 deuce rainbow, 8-3 deuce rainbow, 6-3 deuce rainbow. Not all 3 flushes, big pairs, good suited aces. I think this is reasonable. I might even go a little bit tighter just given the tournament situation. If we take a look at, dropping it down to say something like here, now he's starting to fold some of those, weaker combos again, but still pretty strong. Let's just use this. I think this is at least a reasonable range to give him. And then let's also take a look at my defending range. One of my points of decision would be, should I be having a 2-betting range here on third, and if so, what would be the hands? Well, let's go ahead and narrow down my weak hands first, since we know I'm not going to be defending super wide in the situation at all. I'm going to maybe put it to something like 40-ish% for a starting point, and then just look at what the very, very top hands are. Those are the ones in green, right? So we have aces, of course, and rolled up are really the only 2 hands that are really crushing his range. Every other hand is pretty weak here, so I think this would be a good situation to slow play if I did have a very, very strong top of range hand. Let's look at something. It looks like if I put it at top 40%, I am folding some split 3s. I don't know if I would actually find that in game, so this might be a little too loose, but this looks like an okay point. I mean, this is basically defending almost any 2 low. This is almost a little too tight. I don't think I could play this tight in game. Let's kick it up a little bit and look at something like 50%. Now we're playing all split 3s. We're playing all lows. We're playing basically all 3 flushes. This looks a little bit more like what I would expect, right? So I'm just trying to I was trying to get this King 5 offsuit combo out there, but it's just not that big of a deal, guys. So this would be the starting point for range versus range, and obviously when I have ace-3-5, I'm feeling decent about my hand. If we look at ace-5 rainbow here, I mean, I'm a small favorite at range on range, but the hands are running pretty close, hot and cold. So let's go back to the action, and we'll pick up our analysis in a moment. So the first point here is that on 4th Street, a very interesting street develops because he catches open 3s, and I catch an offsuit 7, and he decides to check, and I decided to bet. And in game, I thought that I would have a playing advantage by having the low board against what appeared to me to be 3s with oftentimes 2 low cards that are going to be a little bit hard to play on later streets against me. I didn't expect him to fold any hands here, but I thought I would generate fold equity on future streets, and I thought my hand would be a small favorite and enough to bet. Let's see if my assumptions were right. I'm a little bit concerned in retrospect that my assumptions were not going to be right here. So we're going to give João the 3. and we're going to give me the offsuit 7. I think it was a heart, but it doesn't really matter. And let's update our equities here. Range versus range first, and then we'll look at individual hands. So range versus range, a good street for Zhao, and that makes some sense. His high hands here are doing very well when he makes 2 pair. The 7 is sort of a mediocre card for me. So I thought I should maybe narrow down his range overall in this situation by thinking that he would bet some of his strong high hands and check some of his lows. But as I think back on this analysis in retrospect, I think his play to just check maybe a lot of hands here is good. If we look at his weakest hands, right, what are some of the weaker hands that he might have in the situation? Well, they would be, random 3 low cards. So something like 6-5-3. But I notice that even these hands are a small favorite against my range here. And so it looks like basically theoretically, guys, you're in a cash game situation, he's probably just supposed to bet his range here, given that I should have a wider defending range. And it looks like he doesn't really have any hands that are underdogs to my range, right? I think I made a small mistake in this hand just looking at this analysis because I need to protect my weaker overall range here, and my individual hand is not even a favorite if he's going to... It basically is, I don't know if you guys can see that, it's a little bit dim font, but I'm basically 50.9, 51% versus his range here. So very, very close. But given my overall range is so weak, I think I would have done a little bit better to check. I think this was a little bit of an overzealous bet on my part and a small mistake. I like Zhao's play here. He decided to slow play. When you have a high hand, it's a little bit vulnerable in stud 8 or better because you can get free rolled right away, right? Part of the problem here is that if I catch another low card, his hand is going to become very quickly a mediocre hand. On the other hand, though, he does catch a nice street here. He catches an 8, and I catch an offsuit king, or a king suits my 7, I suppose. And so the question is, should we narrow down this range at all? And I think, if I was really going to dive deep into it, I do think that I should split my range here on 4th Street, or, tinker with this range a little bit. But for the purposes of just sort of seeing if I bet everything and he check calls everything, which is at least a reasonable plan to consider, let's update it with no changes to... Oops, that's not the right card. Let's update it with no changes to our 2 overall ranges. And let's notice this is definitely going to be a good street for Zhao. And I think maybe he could have considered a small change here and come out with a bet in this situation. I mean, this is a lot of equity, and I understand from a stack preservation point of view, he definitely wants to de-escalate and make sure the pot doesn't grow too large, but this is just an excellent street for him, versus both with his hand, which is obviously doing very well against my range, but also just with his overall range. And I recognize that while it was an okay street for my individual hand, I mean, I do pick up the 3 flush and I do have a good 4 low, it was overall not a good street, and after Zhao checks, which again, I think may be a small mistake here, but I can definitely understand on the stone bubble here the implications and the reasons for de-escalating. I decided to check back on the street, which I think is good. So if I'm going to get a free card here on 5th Street, then now my 4th Street bet doesn't seem quite as bad to me anymore. One other thing I want to look at real quick is just let's look at like how is Zhao doing with his bad low hands here. Notice that even his weak lows are now 56%. And again, he does have a lot of deceptive high hands as we can see from the actual hand. So my thinking would be here that this street is just too good for him to check, even though he's trying to preserve stack and keep from escalating the pot size. After check, obviously we need to reduce ranges a little bit here to be very thorough, but 6th Street is not going to be... Actually, I guess 6th Street is relatively interesting because in this situation, Zhao decides to bet. So obviously this is going to be a good street for him, even without narrowing the ranges. And obviously I have to call. So I don't think there's too much to analyze from my point of view in this hand. We can see how his equity changes here on this street. It should be even better for him. So he caught a king of diamonds and I catch an offsuit jack. So if we don't even update the individual hands, which I think we should, but that would be relatively nuanced, really diving into the individual combos, which StudFlopDraw Alpha is excellent for. But if we just look at range versus range, given our earlier street ranges on this card, we should see, again, another increase in equity for him. And at this point, he decided to go ahead and bet for value, which makes total sense. It's just a good street for him, and it's really nothing for him to fear, especially with his actual holding, right? I mean, Queens is a powerhouse in this situation, but even his weaker holdings are doing quite well here. We can see all green for Zhao. And for me, very clearly a weak street, but I think I definitely need to continue here. 28% hot and cold, not great, but I am getting a very good price, and there's a decent chance that I'm up against just threes in a low draw. So when I'm up against that sort of a hand, I'm obviously going to have even more. I'm going to have more equity than 28%, and I am getting a good price to continue here. So this street seems pretty straightforward. The river, interesting from both perspectives. So Zhao is unimproved here, but notice that he has really disguised his hand at this point, right? He's played very passively, and I catch an ace, which is, in this situation, quite an awful card to catch against his actual hand, and overall a difficult card to catch against his range, because I would think that he would have a decent number of two pairs here, both given the line he's taken. You know, he would have a lot of pocket pairs, he might pair that 8, he might have trips at some frequency, and then of course just pairing one of his low cards on the river. I do think he should go for value here if he were to make two pair on the river. So let's see, what would be the best way to analyze this? Because we do need to narrow down my range at this point a little bit. I don't think that we need to narrow down his range as much. He doesn't really have any bad hands here, and all these hands would have incentive to bet on 6th Street. But I think we probably need to narrow down my range, because my weakest hands would probably need to fold here, right? I'm not continuing on 6th Street with something like the 10-6 offsuit anymore, right? I don't have any high or any low draw. So I think we're probably going to want to narrow down my range here to basically just legitimate low draws. Let's see, where do we draw the line here? So something like this looks kind of right to me. I mean, I guess that's got to be a little wider, because I probably would have continued any low draw here. So something maybe like around here. This would still have me continuing pairs, so any split threes here, it would have me continuing only only flush draws that have a 4 low, and then possibly hands that have like some sort of extra high value, which have a little bit of showdown equity and like could make one pair. This seems a little wide, guys, but at least reasonable to narrow down my range and get rid of those very, very weakest hands. So for the purposes of, you know, a cursory analysis for one hand here, let's look at this situation, and then of course we need to update the boards going into the river. And let's see, what would be the best way to give him a range on the river? I think we should just not update his range, but we can give me an ace on the river. So let's see if this will, if StudFlopDraw will allow us to do this here. Okay, it does. So obviously I've jumped up in equity here because the ace is a good card for my range, but notice that it's not a particularly good card for my hand, actually. Against his range, my split aces here only has 32% because of all those high hands that he does have here. And I think if you think about the way the hand was played, it's looking kind of bad from both an exploit and a game theory point of view here. It does seem more likely than not that he would have a high hand the way he's played and go ahead and value bet the river. If he had something like a low draw with unimproved threes and just makes a low on the river, that would be the main question, would he bet that for value? I will say, I think this is a spot that people bet, they don't bet nearly enough. Like if you are Zhao here and you just had a random low draw and on the river you catch something like a, let's go ahead and update his hand here too. Let's go ahead and give him, offsuit 5 on the river. So this is going to give him a bunch of lows, right? Let's look at his equity with individual hands here. If he has something like deuce 3, 5, 7, 8 with a pair of threes, he's got an equity edge and he's going to have a playing edge, right? It's extremely hard for that hand to get scooped. The only type of hand that can scoop an 8 low and a pair of threes here is if I somehow make a low and a flush or a low and a straight. And these are obviously just a very, very narrow part of my range. I mean, it's very unlikely that I can have a hand that strong. It's almost impossible, honestly. I can't have a straight. No, obviously when we catch the ace. So this is a little bit no lock to the ace. But like I would say that it is a situation where he should bet for value with any low plus pair to try to get me to fold one slightly higher pair. That would be to put me into a tough decision for half the pot. But I don't think people actually do that often, and I think especially on the bubble here, people would be playing a little bit carefully. And so I think I made a bit of a mistake in this hand by paying off the river bet. Catching the ace is not really all that different than catching a 5. I mean, it's really no different at all, right? So it really only blocks his low hands, which actually makes him a little bit more likely to have a good high. So after thinking about this hand and looking it over, I don't think I'm being results oriented to say I think he's going to be a little bit more weighted towards high hands, and I wish I would have found a very, very tight and disciplined fold here on the river. I'm hoping when I call the river here to tie against a low and a pair And you could see me, I am thinking about it, and this was basically my thought process in the moment. Would he bet a low in a pair? I decided that he would, but after thinking about it more, I'm not sure that assumption is valid, and I do think blocking aces here is quite bad for me against his overall range. And we do see me get scooped here in another stud 8 pot, my stack falling to 835k after this hand. And I have to tell you guys, as we look over some hands here on the stone bubble in the future, on future videos for this 50k PPC bubble, this was the first moment in the tournament where I really felt like there was a chance that I was going to bubble. I never was felt in danger until after this hand, and then all of a sudden, the guy at the table that had a clear shorter stack than me is now scooping up my chips. I've fallen down to 10 big bets, which starts to feel pretty shallow when you're on a 100k bubble. And yeah, we're going to see in future hands how I managed to navigate this bubble because I did manage to survive, but it's definitely getting to be a dicey situation, and this stud 8 round has not been kind to me. Let me know what questions you guys have. I think this was a very interesting hand. I definitely think I made some mistakes in this hand. I like the way my opponent played it for the most part. You could quibble a little bit with his 5th and 6th street decisions, but overall, a very interesting hand from both players. Let me know what you think. Stud 8 is one of my favorite games because the analysis can be quite complicated, and the game is hard to play, but this one did not work out for me. See you guys in the comments. Thanks.